I think to say that the New York Giants took a step back in 2024 would be almost disrespectful to teams that actually just took a step back last year. Not only did the Giants watch their season crumble before their eyes last year, they had to sit and watch as the guy they drafted with the number 2 overall selection in 2018 hoist the Lombardi Trophy with their division rival Philadelphia Eagles. All while having arguably the greatest season a running back has ever had in the NFL when you include the postseason. And this was a guy they could have had if they just decided to open their pocketbooks a little more. And while that was bad, they also had to see that the money that they gave to Daniel Jones that they should have given to Saquon Barkley, that part makes it even worse. And then you see Daniel Jones get shipped out of town barely halfway through the season last year. All in all, this was a year that was pretty rough for the players and especially the fans of the New York Giants. And especially if you're a young fan of the New York Giants where you haven't seen this team win a Super Bowl, because this last year was probably the worst year ever of your fandom of the New York Giants. Offensively, this team, to say that we're pedestrian offense would be keeping it pretty light. Between Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, and Tommy DeVito, this team was 28th in total passing yards while throwing only 15 touchdowns to 13 interceptions. Rookie Tyrone Tracy actually proved to be a better fit with that offense than the Saquon Barkley replacement that they signed, Devin Singletary. Tracy had a 1,000-yard year from scrimmage, and fellow rookie Malik Neighbors actually proved to be one of the few offseason additions that actually worked, as in his first year, Malik set the team record for receptions in a season with his 109, and he only trailed Odell Beckham Jr.'s 2014 season in terms of rookie receiving yards. Now, the Giants spent a decent amount of money on Devin Singletary, a guy who, like I said earlier, was viewed as the replacement for Saquon Barkley. He even had the exact same number as Saquon Barkley, which I think if you're a front office member of that team, allowing that to happen was probably a huge mistake. Well, even though Singletary was the replacement for Barkley, Barkley had almost five times the amount of rushing yards as Singletary. He had almost 4 times the amount of touchdowns. And like everyone knows, he raised the Super Bowl trophy after beating the Kansas City Chiefs this year. The comparison between these two players is actually laughable before you consider the fact that Saquon wanted to be back and only costed the Eagles about $7 million a year more on average for the same length of contract. Now, while $7 million might seem like a lot of money for a running back, the Giants paid Devin Singletary to basically do nothing. And if you're telling me at the beginning of the year you spend that extra $7 million on Saquon Barkley and this offensive line maybe stays a little healthier, and going into this season you have Barkley, Malik Neighbors, maybe still Daniel Jones, and some other pieces, this team looks a lot different and is at a lot different point of their rebuild than they are right now. Right now, they're pretty much restarting their rebuild. And if this was, like I said, with Barkley still on the team, possibly with Daniel Jones still on the team, they're at a much different stage of their rebuild than they are. I did mention the offensive line. This was also another really bad year for the offensive line. Free agent signing Greg Van Roten did play every single snap for the Giants, but is that really much of a compliment considering that the Giants were 23rd in rushing and tied for 21st in sacks allowed? Young players who have had very valuable first-round selections used on them in Evan Neal and Andrew Thomas, who also signed a 5-year, $117 million extension back in 2023. Both of these guys had foot and ankle injuries during the 2024 season, and for Evan Neal, I don't blame him as much because the New York Giants actually misdiagnosed a fractured ankle as a sprain back in 2023 for him, which delayed his ability to be on the football field during this year's training camp and throughout the 2024 season, which sheds even more doubt on the personnel and training staff of the New York Giants. The defense was pretty much equally as bad as the offense this last year. And while losing Saquon Barkley might go down in NFL history as the worst relinquishment of a homegrown talent ever, the loss of Xavier McKinney to the Green Bay Packers was pretty bad as well, as McKinney would go on to be a first-team All-Pro safety. The Giants were actually decent against the pass this year, as they were 8th in sacks and 8th in pass defense. Otherwise, they were pretty much just bad at everything. The trade for Brian Burns proved to add a lot of talent, and he did have a decently successful year for New York this year. And, they form a pretty good trio between himself, Dexter Lawrence, and Kayvon Thibodeau. The problem is that Thibodeau had by far his least productive year as a pro, notching only 5.5 sacks, which was about half as many as he had in 23, when he looked like he was about to become a borderline Pro Bowler. So all of these things about the New York Giants should go to highlight one major thing going into this offseason. There has to be a better performance from everybody. I think the coaching staff, I think the front office, I think every single person in that building, not named John Mara because he is the owner, there should be a little bit of like our feet are to the fire now with this 2025 season. Because in 2022, they probably got a lot more leeway. And in 2023, when they saw Daniel Jones go down with injury, it was just like, 2024 will come back. We won't bring back Saquon for whatever reason, but we're going to try to improve upon that 2022 year when we made the playoffs and beat the Vikings in the wild card round. 2024 was such a failure that if 2025 is anywhere near that, I could see just a clean house. And there's Black Monday in the NFL after Week 18, or previous years in Week 17, after that last game of the year. That's usually the day we see a lot of firings, a lot of mutual parting of ways between teams and their front office staff members or their coaching staff members. And like I said, if 2025 is a continuing of the disappointment and the failure that 2024 was, it's going to be a very dark Black Monday for the New York Giants and their coaching staff and their front office members. So how do we keep that from happening? Well, to begin with, I don't think the New York Giants are losing a lot in free agency this year if they don't re-sign anybody. It would obviously hurt to lose more homegrown talent guys like Darius Slayton or Jason Pinnock. However, there are young guys at those positions that could fill those voids, or you could also look to replace those guys in the draft this year. The only other two guys that are hitting free agency that made contributions last year or have made contributions in the past are Greg Van Roten and Isaiah Simmons. Other than that, there are a lot of fringe guys that could come or go without me really batting much of an eye. Getting a QB in free agency this year is a must. Free agency in the offseason this year without acquiring a QB is a failure. It's a failure. And it needs to be a quarterback that the Giants are comfortable with starting a large portion of, if not all, of 2025, regardless of if they draft a quarterback this year. Andy Dalton, who, yes, his best days are well behind him, but he can still play a good brand of football for 10 to 12 games a year and can help guys like Tyrone Tracy, like Malik Neighbors, and hopefully, if they want Theo Johnson to develop, Andy Dalton could possibly help Theo Johnson as well. I really like that, I think a lot of what Malik Neighbors does well, AJ Green, when he was very successful with Andy Dalton, AJ Green was very successful with a lot of the same things and traits that Malik Neighbors has that makes him successful. So playing with Andy Dalton, I think there's some knowledge that could be shed upon Malik Neighbors about how to be even better. I would also like to see a young guy come in through free agency that is not expected to play, but still would add some competition to the room, especially if a draft pick is used on the position. Somebody like a Trey Lance, a Zach Wilson, or even Desmond Ridder type guy, who all I am sure are eager to prove their previous teams wrong. I also would not rule out Russell Wilson coming into New York and being the starting quarterback next year. Next is a playmaker or two, someone who can really help mentor Malik Neighbors, like a Keenan Allen, a Robert Woods, a Brandon Cooks, or even bringing back Darius Slayton would all be a good idea. 4 guys, I guess, that I just mentioned that would be productive in spots or would be a mentor, or would be both. Keenan Allen, the tough part about the Giants this year is they have not a great amount of money. They're around the middle in terms of the rest of the league's cap space going into the 2025 free agency. And like in Keenan Allen's case, even at age 33, Keenan Allen could command over $10+ million a year. And if you're the Giants, I feel like their thought is we kind of have to overpay for some of these veteran players that are looking to win. Because Keenan Allen, I'm sure, doesn't really look at the New York Giants as a possible contender. He wants to win a Super Bowl ring. He wants to, he wants to do whatever he wants, but also be on a competitive team. And the Giants don't really present that opportunity. So, like a lot of these other free agent vets, they're going to have to overpay for guys. Keenan Allen, I would be fine with overpaying for Keenan Allen or Robert Woods or Slayton to bring him back or even Brandon Cooks if it works out in terms of helping Malik Neighbors and helping the rest of the wide receiver room. At running back, I also, maybe overpay a little bit for J.K. Dobbins or Rico Dowdle, two guys who last year were pretty good backs in their own right. And it's the same case because I just don't know how much veteran players are going to want to go to the Giants, knowing that this also can be a completely different coaching staff in 2026. And they might not be viewed as highly as this current coaching staff views them now. And so I would only do 1-year deals for these guys. 1 to 2 year deals with maybe the second year being a player or a team option. That's exactly how I would target these guys is, come to New York, get a good payday for a year, get a great payday to end your career. That's kind of how I would pitch it to these guys if they come to the New York Giants. I don't have a graphic for the offensive line or the tight ends. The Giants have 3 young tight ends on their roster. I would let them figure it out between themselves who's going to take the number 1 spot. And the offensive line is pretty much set in stone if they stay healthy. But even during the season, if they don't stay healthy, I can't predict that, and I can't predict the guys that they're going to get in place of that. They have Evan Neal. They have Jermaine Eliumanor. They have Andrew Thomas. They have John Michael Schmitz. It's that other guard position where even though they don't have Aaron Stinney coming back either, they have guys like Danielle Iziudo. They have a lot of other guys that played last year that I'm sure they feel comfortable putting in at guard if Greg Van Roten doesn't come back. And they have a pretty high draft pick with a lot of very good interior offensive linemen in this year's draft, where I think even if you lose Greg Van Roten, I'd be fine with just drafting a guy to replace him. Now, the New York Giants defense, it's a bit funky when you want to talk about positions because guys like Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns are listed as linebackers, even though, yes, they do play outside linebacker, but they're edge rushers. And so, Spot Track lists that the New York Giants have 8 defensive tackles and 1 defensive end on the roster. And while this might not be totally accurate, there is some truth to that statement when you look at some of the guys that are those defensive tackles. Dexter Lawrence is the obvious star, and he could use a good running mate in the trenches to help muck up the running game with him. A guy like B.J. Hill or Folorunsho Fatukasi would fit that bill for them. Now, linebacker. This is where, if I'm somebody in that room, this is just me personally. I am doing everything in my power to convince Joe Shane and the rest of the guys who are involved with signing players to deals. Throw a absolute bag at Dre Greenlaw or at Zach Bond. We cannot go back into this year with Micah McFadden, Bobby Okereke, and Darius Muasau as our linebackers. We cannot do it because it did not work. It will not work, and it's never going to work. But if you get one of those guys at the top of their game, paired with that defensive line and with the pass rushers that they have, the Giants' defense would take a huge step forward. Like I said, the problem is that the Giants are already spending around $18 million next year on those 3 guys I mentioned. So somebody would have to go, and it probably would be Bobby Okereke, due to his age and how much money he's owed. But I'm not comfortable with Micah McFadden on the field either. I'm not comfortable with Darius Muasau on the field either. Zach Bond and Dre Greenlaw, like I said already, if they're at the top of their game, they improve this defense tenfold. In the secondary, can we please get some veteran presence? The young guys performed well last year, but not good enough to think that an old head on the field would make a world of a difference in a positive manner. But it has to be somebody who's done this at a high level for a long time. Tyrann Mathieu, how hard could it be to try to pry a 33-year-old safety who's paid $13, $14 million from a New Orleans team that obviously wants to start all the way over? The Saints would probably be very interested in anything around a 4th-round pick to offload the money for the Honey Badger. Justin Simmons, in actual free agency from Atlanta, would be another option, and would definitely slot in as a good replacement for Jason Pinnock, who you replace somebody who is young and with talent and, with modern speed, with somebody like Justin Simmons who improves the knowledge of everybody around him and makes that secondary play a lot better. Now, moving to the draft for the New York Giants. I have a few goals in mind for this team for the draft strategy. The first is to get a quarterback added at some point. And if it's not Shedeur Sanders in the first round, then I'd be happy with them buying low on somebody like Jalen Milroe, Quinn Ewers, Will Howard, Dylan Gabriel, or Tyler Shuck. The only guys I personally would not be comfortable taking would be Cam Ward at the number 3 spot or Jackson Dart sometime later. Now, with the number 3 pick specifically, Shedeur Sanders is the number 1 option. I think Shedeur Sanders is the only option if you're taking quarterback. And if Abdul Carter is available at 3, Shedeur Sanders is gone, then take Abdul Carter. If they can't get either of those guys, I would just trade back. I'm not forcing anything with that pick. I'm trading back somewhere in the 6 to 11 range. Get somebody like Will Campbell to play guard. He slots in very easily to replace Greg Van Roten if they don't bring him back. Or they get someone like Titaroa McMillan. They get someone like Emeka Ibuka, Luther Burden, to play receiver opposite of Malik Neighbors for hopefully the next 10 years or so. Now, in day 2 and day 3 of the NFL draft, the New York Giants have at least 7 more selections through this year's draft process, and they would obviously probably have more selections if they trade back from number 3. Another cheap, controllable running back to pair with Tyrone Tracy would be cool. If they had Quinshon Judkins paired up with Tracy behind a healthy O-line that adds Will Campbell at guard, this offense already just becomes so much better in the running game. Now, while earlier I did say that tight end was a position I wouldn't add to in free agency, if Harold Fannin Jr., who, if you don't know, set the record for most receptions and most receiving yards from a tight end in a single season in college football history, if that guy is available with one of their 3rd or 4th round picks, I would start to get very excited to draft this dude because the value I think he would add compared to other 3rd or 4th round picks, I think he outweighs that value. Like I said, he might have had one of the greatest years from a college football tight end ever, at least in a very long, long time. And depending on how he performs during the NFL scouting combine, his draft stock might skyrocket. All in all, I would really not spend as much draft capital on the defense as I would with the free agency money. I think add young, talented, and cheap players to the offense would turn this team into a possible playoff candidate if their defense can have a similar increase to their talent and ability added through free agency. To put a cap on it, the Giants front office and coaching staff need 2025 to be a good year. Owner John Mara was obviously displeased with how this season went down, from the offseason all the way to how the Super Bowl was. Which, if I'm a Giants fan, I guess that does at least intrigue me a little bit. Thinking maybe these guys are going to have their feet to the fire a little bit more. But time will tell if they're actually able to do well with their draft selections and how they decide to spend their money in free agency. But this has to be the year to at least improve That at least needs to be the floor of their goals next year, is to improve. Because if they're the same as they were last year, like I already said, there's going to be a lot of people fired next year.